Bismillahi wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So it's been a very long while. I've taken my break, right, from giving talks, but alhamdulillah, I'm back. So I'm back with a topic where it's one of the most frequently, how should I put, received question amongst Muslims or even non-Muslims. Like, can I ever change, right? It's part of me. It's part of my habit. It's part of my upbringing. I can never change, right? So I want to talk about how it is actually a phenomena that's been studied by psychologists. It's actually dated back to 1960s, particularly in 1967. There's a group of scientists who decided to carry out quite a cruel experiment on animals. So what happened is, so there are two groups of dogs. One group has been subjected to electric shock without any of their choices. So it's out of their control. And there's another group of dogs, who have been subjected with random electric shocks again, but this time they have the choice of either jumping over a lever or jumping to the other side to escape the shock, right? And in these two groups of animals or dogs has been taken out of the experiment for a while, and then afterwards, now they're placed in the same environment, again experiencing shocks, but this time, they both have the choice of escaping the shock by jumping over the lever, okay? And surprisingly, the first group of dogs who have been given electric shock, regardless of whatever they do, didn't really make the choice of escaping that shock. Meaning they come by to accept that this is something that is outside of the control, so they decide to do nothing about it. So they remain complacent, lay down, and to come and to bear with the shocks, right? Even though their choices of escaping that shock was made available for them then, right? So scientists need to teach them how to escape the shock afterwards. Treats, or even treats, or even what do you call those? Motivation, incentives didn't really help them out of that situation, right? So this is a common phenomena called learned helplessness, right? And then later on, there's another group of scientists who did a similar experiment on human beings. Instead of shocking them, of course, what they did was they provide participants with a test or a task to complete. And then, meanwhile, they were projected with annoying noises, disturbing noises, right? Two groups of participants again. And then one group of the participant have the choice to switch off the music or the noise. And then the other group doesn't, right? And the performance from those who have the choice, despite them then not exercising that choice, that means they allow the music to play, even though they have the choice, actually outperform those who doesn't have the choice. So this is again a phenomena called learned helplessness, right? And how is that related to us, right? Essentially, if there is ever an experience that we can recall from our childhood or from our upbringing that is closely related to this phenomena, would be the schooling system, right? We are learned to accept that there are many scenarios or circumstances that's outside of our control, nowhere more than we do at school, unfortunately. And especially when we might have come from an upbringing where, especially from the Eastern culture, where results are probably the most important aspect of governing one's success of children, is placed in high esteem And so that leads children to believe that there is something that is always outside of their control. Right? And this is something particularly more prevalent in the schooling system, especially in the East. Where I remember I was talking with a teacher, and then he was mentioning about how some of the teachers would never compliment their students, right? Thinking that compliments will actually affect them through thinking that they're already very good, right? But I remember I was doing a course on parenting, and then one key feature they mentioned about when it comes to praising or punishing children, in order to encourage children to jump out of their comfort zone, to actually try out something new, to even try out something that they're not confident in, would be actually to praise their effort, but not their result. Meaning, for example, if somebody did good in their exams, right, instead of praising the grades they got, it's best to actually acknowledge the effort they put, right? That way, they can actually overcome that lack of self confidence when it comes to attempting something that they are not confident in doing. So I remember one of the most difficult thing I remember teaching back then, right, was to actually encourage children to try out questions or examples that they are not confident in. Many of them would actually think of themselves incapable of accomplishing something that they are not confident in. Right? But little do they know they have the skill, they have the tool to actually accomplish that question or that example. Right? So it's actually very prevalent in the community we are in, right? So the next question would be, how is then that related to our topic here? Or how is that related to Islam in particular, right? So basically, before I even go into the practice or what is encouraged in Islam, right? There's a very important perspective we should understand is that we should never really take studies like this as a means of justifying the practice of Islam. Like, for example, some of the most occasion reason I hear that Muslims would explain to their non-Muslims about why do we fast, right? They would always explain maybe some of the health benefits that modern scientists seems to conclude with fasting, right? As a reason to justify why Muslims fast. But in fact, why we Muslim fast is not because of those health benefits. Or there might be health benefits that come along, but that's not the reason why we fast, right? And then so never take studies of this nature to justify some of the practice of Islam or justify some of the priorities in Islam, the teachings of Islam, right? But it should be the other way around. Like, out of the many practices in Islam, there comes with lots of benefits that's beyond our comprehension or even beyond the studies are capable of proving. Like, for example, if you come across a doctor or a financial analyst, right, they will give you advice, and most of the advice might not be completely understandable, right? But you would still believe it because they are experts of their field, right? But likewise, these are not ordinary advice by human beings, by experts, but it's an advice from Allah and His Rasul. Right? And there are so many benefits to extract, so it's never too limited within the scope. And the next question would be then, what are the practices that would bring about benefit, right? What are the practices in Islam that would bring about benefit? Right? The answer is all of them would. All of them would. But what kind of benefit will it bring about? Now that is up to you to explore, or that is up to you to experience, right? And then so that's why it's never to justify or to limit the practice or the benefit that scientists or studies have found that justify the experience or the practice of Islam. So the next thing would be, so at the end of the day, how do we Muslims see change? Or how do we Muslims even change or to improve ourselves, right? And Allah actually answered us in one of the most powerful surah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taken one of the most numerous oaths to make this one point. Because actually, we all know that in the Quran, Allah would make oaths, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would make oaths. And then the oaths is to, so there is oaths made, and there is what we call the subject of oaths made. So meaning, all those oaths are to just bring to our attention the main point Allah is trying to give out, right? And so this surah, as you may have already heard of or even memorized, is Surah Sams, right? And when Allah sweared by wa nafsi wa ma sawaha, right? And when Allah created the soul, He proportioned it, right? What does that mean? Not only is it pure from birth, it is actually very well molded, right? And then Allah mentioned about فَأَلْهَمَهُ فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا, right? And it's normally translated as Allah instilled or inspired that soul of good and evil, right? But in fact, like fahal hamaha actually means to help them distinguish. So instead of actually mistranslating it as Allah instill wickedness or evil in people, it's actually Allah giving us human beings the faculty or even the inclination to recognize good and to forbid evil. So that's why in Islam, we never really argue against that there are people who are genuinely good, right? Even people of other faiths, right? There are people who are genuinely good. It's because Allah has molded us to recognize the good and the evil, right? So imagine now, our soul has been born pure from birth, and then now we have been given the faculty to distinguish what is good and bad, right? Technically, we have everything, right? But no, Allah mentioned about then comes what? Our effort, right? Qad aflaha man zakkaha, right? Like, and those indeed who have succeeded are those who purify themselves, right? Even though despite having been born pure, being born perfect, right? And even with the faculty of distinguishing what's good and bad, that other element that is much needed for our success is our effort, right? Our effort. So that's why even with those ability, it's not enough to give us success. But now this is where Allah wants our effort. This is where our effort will actually make us successful. And so despite we having no control over the circumstances or environment we're born in, right? But we have been given the tool, and now Allah is asking us the effort, the conscious effort, to work against the environment which might not be in favorable to ours. Like, we don't get to choose the school we study in. We don't get to choose the parents who raised us, right? And sometimes what instill in us are values that's against our nafs or against this Islamic practice, right? But now is the choice where we can actually work against this environment or this upbringing of ours that's against this purity, right? And then there's another perspective, and those waqad kabaman dasaha, right? And those who buries their soul, right? Instead of purifying it, there's another group who would actually bury them, right? To go with the flow, to live with the environment, despite it corrupting the soul from the very beginning, despite every single ounce of the environment screaming against the soul, which was pure in the beginning, right? But you decide to bury your consciousness of the right and wrong, just so to live by the environment, to bury it in the environment. So that's why we are told to be always in this constant state of tazkiyah, trying to purify ourselves, because we have no control over the environment. The only control is the effort we can put in. And that alone is enough for Allah to guarantee us success. That alone is enough to guarantee us success. Allah has never asked us to be purified. Allah just needs of us effort, purification, the effort of purification. Now then, imagine the extreme scenario whereby going into a test and the examiner only asking you the effort of being there in the test. Right? Imagine that effort of just going to the test is enough to guarantee a pass. Who then would refuse ever going to that test? Right? Even though we have been raised up in an environment where effort is usually not considered important, right? Whereby the grades you receive actually matters more, or whereby your supervisor or at your workplace, where they matter more on your productivity, your scales, your sales, the sales target you've been trying to meet, right? But Allah is asking of us different, right? He needs of us just to be there for the test. Just to be there for the test is enough to guarantee you a success, right? And so the next question would be, what then are we trying to work against, right? And the main enemy, even before shaitan, would be our nafs. Exactly. Even before shaitan would be our nafs. This is actually the greatest enemy. To the extent where Abu Bashir rahimahullah actually narrate that Hassan radhiyallahu anhu actually mentioned, rarely there is a servant who would be engaging his entire life in jihad, but he have never hold a sword. Rarely there is a servant who's been engaged entirely in jihad, but has never once touched a sword. What does that mean? That means he's been constantly fighting the battle against his nafs. Right? And another narration where Abdullah ibn Amr who actually mentioned, he was once asked about what do you say about jihad and military campaigns, right? And Abdullah mentioned about it begins with your soul, wage jihad against it, and begin with your soul and wage a military campaign against it. Right? And then Al-Lahabi actually mentioned that Abu Hamid al-Tusi rahimahullah actually mentioned that everyone is actually capable of obedience. Everyone is capable of being obedient, but none of them are capable of abandoning lowly desire, except for the as-sadiq, of the truthful. Everyone is easy to be obedient, but none of them are actually capable of abandoning their lowly desire except for the as-sadiq, right? And then so back to the point where we don't have a choice against our environment, but we have a choice to work against our nafs, right? So despite all those environments, all those negative upbringing that may have come across affecting our nafs, right? We have the choice, or we have the capability of working against it. Or even if it doesn't happen, even if in the end we die before reaching there, but Allah would have written us successful. Allah would have written us successful, right? And the next thing that we should work against is, of course, shaitan, right? But we should never give him credit. We should never give shaitan credit, because he's never in control of any of our dealings. And there's a narration where Rasulullah actually advised us to never curse the devil, curse shaitan. Because if you curse it, it will bloat up as big as a house. Have you heard of that narration? No. Don't worry, it's actually authentic. right? It's actually authentic. And then don't curse the devil. And then if you do, it will blow up as big as a house. But instead, you should say Bismillah, and it will shrink into the size of a mosquito. Right? So what does that mean? That means don't give Shaitan the credit. Because if you curse Shaitan, you're basically falling into his trap, acknowledging his effect on you. Right? But instead, just remember Allah. That's actually what Surah An-Nas would advise us. Like when Shaitan is described as al-wasil, as was, right? He would appear and disappear. Right? So scholars actually mention when you remember Allah, Shaitan would actually disappear and shrink. Right? The only time where Shaitan has an effect or an influence on you is when you forget Allah. Right? And there is this really powerful, subhanAllah, really powerful, really long at the same time narration, where it's narrated in Ahmed, where Rasulullah actually mentioned about how Shaitan would place obstacle in every way the son of Adam undertakes to obey Allah. Where he starts by, when there is this person who is looking to embrace Islam, right? Looking to embrace Islam and then to abandon the religion of their forefathers or family, and then Shaitan will come to him. You've heard of it. Shaitan will actually come to him. First, he would obstruct his way to Islam by saying, will you adopt Islam and abandon the religion of your family that you were raised upon? Right? And then that person, if he tells Shaitan to go away and disobey Shaitan and becomes a Muslim, then Shaitan will come to him when he's on the way of Hijrah, in his path of Hijrah. He will come to him and saying that, will you immigrate and abandon your land and everything that you have owned, all your wealth and all your shops, to a distant land? And then when Shaitan said so, and the man said to Shaitan, go away, and then disobey him, then Shaitan will come back to him, not only after Hijrah, but now this time in battle. Right? And when the man is going to engage in battle, Shaitan will come to that person and asking him, are you going to sacrifice your life and someone else will share the bed with your spouse? Your wealth will be distributed amongst the inheritors and no one will care for you? Like Shaitan will come to that person with that perspective, like you're sacrificing all those. Right? And if that man again disobey him and continues in the path of Allah, what will Allah do? What will Allah do? Allah has made it a right upon himself, subhanahu wa ta'ala, to admit that person to paradise, whether he's drowned, is cast off of a mountain, or dies of stomach disease, or is hit by a moving saddle. Right? All those, Allah will make sure upon himself that he will enter this person into paradise. Right? And why? Because he was engaged in the most glamorous of battle. Not only against his snuffs, but also against all the whispers that Shaitan has on him. Right? So even to the extent where Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah actually mentioned that if Shaitan actually constantly see you constantly obeying Allah, there's actually a point he will give up. Shaitan will actually give up. And what's the greatest example in Islam? Umar ibn Khattab. Right? When he takes a path, Shaitan doesn't even want to be in the same path. Right? Because he constantly strives against Shaitan. Shaitan has lost his hope against this man. Right? But then we as believers can never be sure that Shaitan will never come to us, even in our last moment. Even in our last moment. Right? So that is our main acknowledgement to begin with. Like our greatest enemy is first our nafs. And then Shaitan, who's always making sure himself is in the way of our obedience to Allah. Right? And then back to that question, Islamically speaking. Can we ever change? Can we ever make the change? Imam Ghazali rahimahullah actually mentioned something really beautiful as an analogy, whereby he mentioned about just as human being managed to tame a bear, control a bear in servitude to human beings, or to actually teach dogs to guide human beings, or even any other animals, is one of the greatest signs that human beings are actually capable of change. Because imagine, animals who have been living their animalistic desires for their entire life, some of the most cruel animals, can still be tamed in servitude for human beings, then what about human beings who have greater willpower, who have the faculty to think for himself, to change? Right? So we don't have any excuse when Allah has put all those signs around us, or even the wildest animals can be tamed. Right? And so how then do we first start with change? So I'm not sure have anybody heard of the Sahaba called Abu Mahjan. Abu Mahjan. Mahjan. Abu Mahjan. No? Now that's the issue. That's the issue. Of course, they were Sahabas who were in the caliber of Umar, Abu Bakr, and their stories would motivate us as Muslims, like how we are capable of achieving great things, right? But yet, there were actually companions who were struggling. And their story should be just as important as those who have achieved great things, right? Because we want that balance, because we know we might not be in the state yet of the calibers of some of the well-known companions, but yet how some of the less well-known companions have underwent change is just as motivating. So who is Abu Ahjan radiallahu anhu, right? He was one of the companions who struggled with drinking. He's the companion who struggled with drinking. So we know that once the final ayah, the third ayah on alcohol is revealed, the streets of Medina flooded with alcohol. People who were drinking alcohol would spat out the alcohol or even induce themselves to vomit or throw up the alcohol they've just drank, right? But there's this companion who loves alcohol, who can never abandon it, struggled. To what extent? He was constantly being lashed because of being caught drinking. Constantly being lashed for being caught drunk. Right? And what happened? To the extent where he actually made a will to his son that if I ever pass away, right, soak my grave with alcohol so my bones can absorb the alcohol. Right? To that extent, he wasn't been able to give up. But then there's something special about him. His inclination or his interest or his will to fight in the path of Allah is so strong that in one occasion, actually he's been drinking like since the time of Rasulullah up to Umar ibn Khattab, Khalifa, whereby when Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas sent out an army to fight in battle, right, and he couldn't deal with this person anymore, right, who's been drinking, right, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas decided to abandon him from joining the campaign. And that to him hurts him most. So he was tied up back and he was hearing the noise of the horses or the swords being swung, but he himself is being tied up. Right? And Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas' wife was actually there to make sure he doesn't leave the place. And what happened next? He asked Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas' wife to let him go, to free him, to join the battle. Right? But Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas' wife, of course, had an order, right? So at first she was very reluctant, but she saw the sincerity in his words. And he made a promise, very funny promise, whereby he mentioned about, I will go in battle and I'm gonna cover my face. I'm gonna cover up my face, so nobody knows you have let me go. And then after the battle, I'm gonna come back and tie myself back up. I'm gonna come back and tie myself back up. Right? And so Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas' wife sees the sincerity in his words, so he let him free. Right? And he went into the battle, fought fiercely. And the funny thing is, since the entire campaign left, right? So there's only one horse where it's actually Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas' horse left, right? And then he had to use that horse to join the battle, right? And Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, when he's in the battle, he saw his own horse being used when it's been supposedly back in Medina, right? And then he noticed this person who fought furiously, and he's very surprised. And to the extent after the battle, he asked whoever was that person, come up, and we will reward you and we'll make dua for you, right? And none of them came out. And then he was very surprised, and then he went back to Medina and then to join his wife. And then when he was discussing with his wife, that, do you know, there was talking about what happened earlier during the day, telling her that there's this warrior who fought fiercely in battle. Right? Do you know who that is? Right? And Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas' wife told him, honestly, that it was Abu Mahya. It was him I freed to join you in battle. And right away, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas embraced him and said, Wallahi, I'm never going to lash you again, even if you drink. Wallahi, I'm never going to lash you again, even if you drink. And what this Abu Mahjan mentioned is really profound. This is the whole point of the story, by the way. He mentioned that I'm never going to drink again. And he never really went on drinking again. What does that mean? The first step to overcoming any change or to adopt any change, you need to give yourself that purpose. And that purpose has to be beyond whatever material purpose that you can ever give yourself. Because if you don't have a reason to change, you'll never change. And that reason has to be greater than any of your lowly desire. That reason has to be greater than any of your lowly desire. So I remember there's this brother who would actually, of course we know the virtue of working a career or to develop a career in order to feed your family, to provide for family, right? But this brother is very special. He would actually take it to another level. He wants to learn that skill set in order to elevate the Muslim community in their knowledge with the IT, with the programming field. Right? That's his intention. So instead of merely just fulfilling goals that his company has set for him, his intention goes beyond that. His intention goes beyond that. Right? And so that's where, when you have a standard higher than yourself, then you are more willing to give up whatever is holding you behind. Even though in Islam, in principle, that there is actually reward. So there's this subtle fiqh discussion where, for example, if you do something that's mundane, when you do something that isn't rewarded, you know, there's this rewardable, sinful, and unrewardable dealings, right? Or things you can do. Right? Scholars mention if you do unrewardable dealings, technically you shouldn't be rewarded, right? But if you do so in order to avoid sins, you're rewardable. You're rewardable for it. And now imagine if you attach yourself not only to just do rewardable things, but to do something that is beyond just rewardable, beyond the purpose of yourself, then how much more will that be rewarded? how much more Allah will see through that sincerity of your intention. Right? And so the second thing that I would advise, generally speaking, is definitely avoiding sins. Right? And there's this really beautiful quote by Sal al-Tursi, rahimahullah, where he mentioned about good deeds are done by the good and the wicked. Good deeds are done both by the good and the wicked. Right? But none refrain from sins except from the truthful. How often do you see reverts, or even people who start practicing Islam, to start accommodating or practicing crazy good deeds? I mean, not just fulfilling the fard, but doing crazy good deeds. Like, for example, fasting occasionally, or even all of a sudden building up a Quran habit that's not sustainable. All those good deeds, right? But how often do you see reverts who actually pay attention to what are the sins between them and Allah? Right? It's so easy to fall into the trap to accommodate or to accumulate good deeds while neglecting the sins that might be in the way between us and Allah, right? So that's why the first step is always to leave off sins, and then to build good habits or to build good deeds. So that's why taqwa actually comes before ihsan. Taqwa actually is acknowledging Allah's sight upon you, and ihsan, perfection, is actually honoring the sight of Allah upon you. Right? So without taqwa, there is no way you can actually achieve ihsan, actually. Right? So that's why it's always first important to leave off sins. And so one of the most motivating statement in Islam is from a hadith Rasulullah mentioned about. So Rasulullah actually mentioned about that for every disease, Allah has ordained a cure to it. For every disease, Allah has ordained a cure to it. And it actually includes spiritual disease and problems, or even sins themselves. But the hard part is, the greater your sin, the greater your desire, the greater of your sin, the more bitter the medicine has to be. Because you would need to fend off. There's a saying in Chinese whereby when you have a greater disease, the medicine you need to take needs to get more bitter automatically, right? Do you need to switch it higher? Yeah. Yeah, because that's the spot. Yeah.
One by one.
Yeah. I was wondering who's around that place that people are avoiding. Okay. Yeah. And then so that's why we should acknowledge that whatever desire or addiction we have, the more we want to fend off it, the more bitter the medicine we need to take. And the most beautiful part is Allah also sees through this struggle of ours. Like, for example, if there's an alcoholic who is going on a business trip, and then in his hotel room, we find there's a beautiful collection of alcoholic beverages, right? For him to fight his desire against those beautiful drinks that is right at his fingertips will be much more rewardable than someone who have never drank. Right? And imagine coming on the Day of Judgment, having fend off, having work our way through the addiction or desire that we have. How much noble, how much higher will we be in position? Right? We're fighting off that addiction, that desire of ours for Allah. Right? We all have our own struggles. We all have our desire. Right? So it's about acknowledging it and then knowing that Allah will reward us according to our struggle, right? And that comes to our third step, that is to never give up on good deeds that is between you and Allah. Even though we mentioned about the importance of leaving off sins, right? But that is not at the cost of living out good deeds that you have made between you and Allah. What does that mean? Abu Bakr al-Shilbi, rahimahullah, he's actually a tabi'in, a scholar of its time. He mentioned a really powerful story. So he's basically from Damascus. He's a scholar from Damascus. And then one day he was traveling with a group of scholars, and then it came about a highway robber where they were tied up. You heard of it? You heard of it? And then so they were tied up, and then their goods were confiscated, taken. And then some of their goods include some almonds and then some sugars, right? And then they've placed it in front of the leader of the highway robber, right? And then they were eating from those goods, right? And then Abu Bakr, rahimahullah, actually noticed something special. He found that the leader himself wasn't eating at all, right? And the sheikh, out of curiosity, asked, why aren't you eating, joining them as well? And then he mentioned about he's fasting. He mentioned he's fasting, right? And then sheikh have the same expression as you did, right? You're robbing us while you're fasting, right? Could never be more Muslim than that, right? Right? And then he mentioned something beautiful. He mentioned something really beautiful. He said, I used to be in good position. I used to be in good place. But Allah, I have closed many doors between me and Allah. But I want to keep this door open. So he actually fast, his voluntary fast, in order to keep this door alive. This door between him and Allah. Right? And years later, years went on, and Shaykh was doing Hajj with many people, right? And on the day of Arafah, he spotted this same robber, this leader of the robber, amidst the crowd, standing longer than others, crying longer than others. Right? And then Shaykh approached this guy. Are you the one that I think he is? And then that robber actually mentioned yes. And he explained himself then that through this door, Allah opened up other doors for me. So no matter how sinful you think you are, never let shaitan convince you that you are never deserving of Allah's mercy. And for that reason, you should always make sure there are avenues, that is between you and Allah that you can always go back to. Right? And then so, remember there's this saying where, this isn't really a saying, or actually, I heard it from a talk from a scholar from the States, I think. And he mentioned about some sisters would actually complain about she doesn't feel herself good enough for hijab, to wear hijab, because she thinks of herself not of a good person, not good in character, so she doesn't think that she's worthy of wearing hijab, right? And that is exactly what shaitan wants us to think. Right? Whenever we see an opportunity of a good deed, we will be convinced that we're not good enough in order to do it. Right? And so beautiful, like when Ibn Abbas, when he was approached by two different people asking the same question, like a person went to him and asked, will I be forgiven if I commit murder? He said no. And another person came and asked the same exact question, and he said yes. The students around him was very confused, perplexed. Why would same question receive different response? Right? And then Ibn Abbas actually explained himself. That person who asked, one of the person who asked that question, actually wanted to commit murder. Right? So in order to stop him from committing murder, he needs to be convinced that he won't be forgiven if he do so. But whereas the other person who asked that question came after committing murder, asking whether will he be forgiven for what he's just done. And that is exactly what Shaitan wants us to do. Before committing a sin, we will be convinced by him that Allah's mercy is wide open. But after committing that sin, Shaitan will actually make sure we're convinced that we're not deserving of Allah's mercy. Right? That is why we should always work against Shaitans. If we know that this is the tactic that Shaitan will convince us of wronging and not repenting afterwards, then make sure this is always at the back of our mind, reminding ourselves, reminding each other that this is what Shaitan wants us to feel like. And then so I'll come to my last point. Am I out of time?
You're okay.
Okay, so I'll come to my last point. So Allah mentioned in Surah An-Kabut, in the last ayah of Surah An-Kabut, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّكُمْ سُبُلَنَا. And those who strive in our path, for us, we will surely guide them in our way. وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ لَمَعَ مُحْسِنِينَ. And indeed, Allah is with those who constantly do good. Why did I quote that ayah? Is because we may sometimes, like we know in Islam, it's actually grave sin to think that Allah will not forgive us. But sometimes we fall into the trap where we are convinced that we are never able to change. We may not give up on Allah, but we may give up on ourselves, our ability to change. Right? And Allah is giving us that affirmation whereby if you seek guidance, if you strive for guidance, Allah has made it upon Himself to make sure those paths you've undertaken will be facilitated, will be helped, because Allah is always with them. Right? So sometimes we may not give up on Allah, but we constantly convince ourselves, consciously or unconsciously, that I can't do this, I can't change, it's too late, right? All these phrases at the back of our mind, even though we may not acknowledge them, right? But it's stopping us from recognizing our full potential, right? And then so Shaitan always wants us to give up, even on ourselves, right? And so this comes to another hadith that I would mention in response to this perspective, right? So a man actually came to Rasulullah. So Ibn Hajar actually considered this authentic, right? And then a man actually came to Rasulullah and asked about a person who committed a sin, right? And he asked what will happen to that person. And Rasulullah mentioned that it will be written for him against him, right? And then the person continued, but what if he sought forgiveness and repented, right? And Rasulullah replied that he will be forgiven and his repentance will be accepted. And then the person asked again, what if he sinned again? Rasulullah mentioned, it will be written against him. And he asked again a follow-up question, what if he repented again? Rasulullah mentioned about he will be forgiven. What if he sinned again? What if he sinned again? It will be written against him. But what if he repented? He will be forgiven. And that Rasulullah will conclude whereby he mentioned he will be forgiven, his repentance will be accepted as long as he's not tired of asking for it. So back to where we started our discussion, whereby we were grown up in an environment where majority of our scenarios or circumstances are outside of our control. Or that's what we've been brought up with, at least, for most people. And now Allah is giving us back the key to control. Whereby, as long as we are not tired of seeking Allah's forgiveness, He's never, never tired of forgiving us. Right? And so we should always ask the enabler to enable us. Right? And so this is actually a very beautiful dua where Rasulullah actually advised Mu'adh ibn Jabal when he was sent to Yemen, right? Allahumma inni ala dhikrika wa shukrika wa husni ibadatika. O Allah, the enabler, enable me to remember you, to be grateful to you, and to worship you as an ibad. And sometimes we may give up on ourselves, but never, never think that we are not deserving of Allah's mercy or support. Because He's always, always there to support us if we really, really strive against Him. Right? And when it comes to dua, sometimes even give up on them. Even though we may be singing them in our... Is it okay?
Keep going.
We may be singing them, like I hate to use this word, singing them in our prayers. Right? But that lack of sincerity, because Rasulullah actually mentioned that in an hadith where he mentioned about call upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with certainty. Right? The only thing that's stopping us from that dua being accepted is from a distracted mind. Allah will not accept dua from a distracted heart. Right? Sometimes we may be making the dua and then we feel like it's never been accepted. I might just as well continue on that habit without even paying attention to the words. Right? That is lacking the greatest condition for any dua to be accepted. Right? That is the mindfulness in our prayer, right? And then I will end with a final ayah, and it's actually one of my favorite ayah in the Quran, right? And it's Surah Al-Hadid, where Allah mentioned about Alam ya'nan lilladhina amanu an takhshahu qulubuhum li dhikrillah wa ma nazala min al-haq, where Allah actually asked us, believers, had the time not come for those who believe to humble their hearts of the remembering of Allah from what has sent down to them? Right? Allah is asking us, had the time not come? And so here Allah used actually past tense, saying that not only is it already too late, it's been in the past. You should have changed. You should have taken the step. Right? From the guidance that's been sent down, you should be humbled. You should have humbled. Right? But then not only is it a warning, but it's also at the same time a reminder, whereby it's already too late. But this is not to scare us off, because Allah continues with the next ayah, أَعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ يُحْيِي الْأَرْضَ بَعْدَ مَوْتِهَا. What does this ayah say? Is that just as Allah has revived the earth who was originally dead to grasses, to land full of grasses, to grounds full of life, He could also do so to your heart. Right? No matter how dead our heart is, no matter how late we are, Allah has again kept that door open to us. Right? So I will conclude with this. I think I've made most of my points. I think so, yeah. Any questions?
Any questions, brothers, here? Okay, I've got a question here.
Yeah, please.
Someone. How to persist on the path of taqwa. We humans usually think there's going to be tomorrow to start again. think what they're asking is, how do you stay on the path of taqwa? I think it's two questions. Number one, how do you stay on this path of taqwa? And number two, how do you fight this mindset where we think, you know what, tomorrow. You know what, tomorrow. You know what, tomorrow.
Beautiful question. And in fact, the second question is an answer to your first, whereby never convince yourself there's a tomorrow to begin with. Never convince yourself there's a tomorrow to begin with. What does that mean? I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's the saying of Ibn Umar, whereby he would mention about, if you ever to wake up that day, never expect yourself to pass Maghrib. And if you happen to live till Maghrib that day, never expect yourself to wake up tomorrow. Right? And there's this ayah in Surah Najm, where Allah would actually collect all the souls every night when we go to bed. Every night, all the souls are collected when we go to bed. Right? What happened next is that Allah will then return the souls only when their time has not come. So that means there are souls that Allah will keep to Himself because their time has come. Right? So never let yourself be convinced that you have another day to live. Because we never know which day is Allah not letting back the soul back to our body. Right? Have I answered the first question? And at the same time, it's actually a consistent habit across the Sahabas, whereby they won't delay matters till tomorrow, even if it means a little bit of an action. Even if it means a little bit of an action. Like, for example, there's this hadith, again a very long narration, about, if I'm not mistaken, it's actually collected in Sahih Bukhari, whereby there's this female sahabi, whereby she wanted to fight in the path of Allah. Right? She constantly asked Rasulullah to fight in the path of Allah, whereby because of her position, she wasn't been able to join many of the campaigns, right? And one occasion, she was finally granted the permission to join the campaign, right? And then in the end, she didn't even make it to the battlefield. Narration mentioned about so that was a campaign where the Muslims need to take ships to a different land. And she tripped herself and got killed when she was boarding the ship. But what is her ending? She is still considered a shaheed. She's still considered someone who's fighting on the path of Allah. Right? Because she took the step, even though she might not have reached the campaign yet, but she's rewarded for it. So never belittle any steps you can take today in order to attain the goal you're looking for. Even if it means it takes time to reach that goal. Right? Did I answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. No, because I feel like I've been sidetracking quite a lot today.
Jazakallah khair.
Yeah, come on. Any more questions?
No? Alright,
سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.